Hey, thanks for joining us for today's conversation. We're going to be talking about church mergers in a second, and one specifically. But I wanted to let these guys have a chance to introduce themselves. This is David and Mark from LCBC. David, can you just introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, happy to. My name is David Ashcraft. I'm the pastor here at LCBC Church. LCBC stands for Lives Changed by Christ. And so excited to be with you today, Tony.
Yeah, and Mark?
Yeah, my name is Mark Stuenzi. I've been on staff at LCBC Church for 11 months. Prior to that, I was the lead pastor of Parker Hill Church in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so I invited these guys to come together on this topic today because they've been through mergers. Well, they've both been through mergers, and most recently merging their two churches. And David, with that, maybe a bit of the backstory. We're going to talk about that merger process. But before we do, can you tell us a little bit about LCBC?
Yeah, so LCBC is about 35 years old. I've been here 31 years. And when I came to LCBC, we had about 150 people. And it's just been exciting to see God work and move. And so we have about 20,000 people now, 19 locations, and God's just been doing some real cool things. So one of our motto is just let's not do anything stupid to mess up what God is doing, and try to stay out of His way as much as we can. So so it's been an exciting journey.
David, of those 19 different locations, how many of them were mergers then?
So 4 of them have been mergers, what I think would be called mergers. We did our first about 10 years ago, and so we've done Parker Hill would be the 4th that we've done. We had one other that a building was given to us, and I think some people would call that a merger. We kind of looked at that as just getting a new building. Yeah.
Okay, well, very good. And Mark, you and I have actually known each other a little bit longer because currently you're the pastor of church development at LCBC. But when I first met you several years ago, you were the senior pastor at Parker Hill Church. So can you give us some of the backstory about Parker Hill?
Yeah, Parker Hill Church came into existence in the 1860s under a different name, different denomination, all of that. I began serving there at the age of 26 back in 1988. I was single. I was just out of Bible college, had no experience. It was a church of about 40 people. They were desperate, so it was kind of a perfect fit. But I stayed there for 33 years, and I sometimes tell people I pastored 8 different churches, all at the same address, because the church changed so much over those 33 years. By the time we merged with LCBC Church, it was a multi-site church with 3 campuses and a weekend attendance pre-COVID of about 2,200 people.
Wow. So a good sized church at Parker Hill too. Just remind me, I think I looked at a map at one point to see where the previous Parker Hill locations are in relationship to the previous LCBC campuses, but what was the proximity of the two churches?
Both in the state of Pennsylvania, but the closest campus to our southernmost campus is 45 minutes away from LCBC's northernmost campus. So 45 minutes separating our 2 closest locations. And then the distance between the broadcast campuses for each church, the main offices, was about 2.5 hours apart.
Okay, all right. And David, I'm correct, right? Those 19 locations are pretty spread out throughout the state of Pennsylvania. Is that right?
They're becoming more so, yeah. When we first started, our name was Lancaster County Bible Church. And even back then with 150 people, we felt like it was presumptuous to call ourselves Lancaster County Bible Church. But as we grew to about 8,000 people in our first location and reached a point where we weren't allowed by the township to grow anymore. So that's what got us multi-site. And our first merger was about 2 hours away, closer to Philadelphia. And our motivation for it, we feel like God is calling us to make an impact on the state of Pennsylvania. And so being able to get closer to Philadelphia quickly through a merger, we thought would be a good situation for us. And so the first one was about 2 hours away. Parker Hill, for the most part, you guys are 2.5 hours away from our original location. Same for a couple, I guess each of the mergers we've done have all been that. And a big part of our motivation is, again, just to get us involved and open the door to another part of the state for us.
Very good. Well, I do want to get specifically into that merger process. And Mark, with that, I think I'll begin with you, just because the way it sounds anyways, you reached out to LCBC. They didn't reach out to you. Is that correct? What
Yeah,
prompted you to do that?
that is correct. And David can speak to this, but in every case, LCBC has never started that conversation with a merger. It's always come from the church that ended up merging with them. But our situation was somewhat unique. We weren't in a desperate situation. The church was still fairly healthy, and appreciate the work that Unstuck Group did with us about 6 years ago. Very helpful, but we were doing okay. But I got to a point where I was starting to experience some stress-related health issues. And after a lot of conversations, my wife and I decided that I needed to step away from senior leadership in the church and all the pressures that go along with that. And when we made that decision, I actually had someone on staff that I really believed would be my successor. But when I began that conversation with him, he let me know that he and his wife had been talking, and he had just decided to go into a different type of ministry, an academic type ministry at a seminary. And so I lost our internal staff successor, but still knew that I needed to make a transition just for my own health, and just it was the better part of wisdom. So that left us with the prospect of pursuing a typical search for a lead pastor, which the pool gets rather small when you're talking about a multi-site church of a couple of thousand people. To get someone with the experience in multi-site and a large church to lead is difficult. And we always found with hiring, it was even more difficult to recruit someone to come to the Northeast United States, Scranton, Pennsylvania in particular. And so we knew the search process would be difficult. And we also knew that after a 33-year tenure, and people just hearing one voice and seeing one style of leadership, that leadership transition would be difficult. And so for us, it wasn't a decision based on desperation. It was a decision based on the mission and the most strategic way to keep the mission moving forward through a significant pastoral transition. And so it was not as easy, perhaps, as it might be in a church that doesn't feel like it has any other options, that has gotten desperate. That wasn't us. We just felt like it was God's best for the future of the gospel in that part of the state of Pennsylvania. And so that's what caused me to approach David and LCBC Church and begin what turned out to be a pretty long conversation about a potential merger.
And so, David, here's my suspicion, because you have locations in different parts of Pennsylvania. I'm guessing you have a number of churches that reach out to you about a potential merger in the future. And my suspicion is you don't actually move forward on all of those requests. And so, couple questions. Number one, why was Parker Hill a good fit for LCBC? And what would have caused you to pause or maybe even decline that invitation to merge the two churches?
Yeah, so Tony, we definitely do have other opportunities. We definitely have said no to a number of them. The very first one we did was just outside of Philadelphia. It's funny, we're in Lancaster, about 2 hours out of Philly. This church is in what we call the suburbs of Philly. They're about 30, 45 minutes from the downtown Philly area. And we think of them as our Philadelphia campus. They say, no, we're not Philadelphia at all. But we felt like it gave us inroads into the Philadelphia market. And being our first one, we had never even considered any kind of mergers like this before. And when Craig, the pastor of that church, approached us, thought there's no way this is ever going to happen, nor will they want to do it. They were a church of over 1,000, and they had a beautiful property, about 50 acres, and a beautiful building, about 100,000 square foot building. And their motivation for wanting to do it in part was financial. The other is they were also going through a succession, and Craig was going to be stepping away from his role. But they had about a $10 million debt that they were wrestling with and struggling to keep up the payments on. And so there was that motivation for them. And the first time we did the merger, and I think maybe true a lot of times with anybody doing their first merger, you kind of want it to happen bad enough that you'll say, okay, sure, we'll pay $10 million to make this happen. And we wouldn't do that now. But the first one, we were like, okay, this is good. And to be honest, as we thought about it, worst case scenario, we've got a beautiful building, beautiful property, and so we're going to come out okay with it. But that was our first attempt at doing a merger, and did it very differently than what we did with Parker Hill. That one, and all the advice we were being given at that point, was to work out all the details and then just kind of do it and do it quick, and make the change. And so in their situation, I want to say it was August when we first announced the congregation, both here and there, that we were going to do this. And there was about 6 to 8 weeks, and then we flipped the switch, and they went from being Branch Creek Community Church to LCBC. And there were some pretty strong differences between the two, and it was a shock for their congregation to go through that change. And so I think what we've learned in the meantime is let's go a little bit slower and take some time to let the new church, the church that's going to be joining us, acclimate themselves to us. So.
Yeah. So with that, Mark, as he's describing this journey that LCBC has gone on with the different churches that they've merged with, I know there was a process that was happening at Parker Hill too. And I have to imagine there were many, many steps to that. But I'm wondering if you could maybe share from your perspective, what were some of the critical components of that process that allowed you to get the buy-in necessary from the Parker Hill congregation to move forward with this merger?
Hey, Mark, before you answer that, I'm sorry, Tony, I was just going to say one of our learnings now 4 times in, and we each time it's been a large church. So Branch Creek was over 1,000, Emmanuel Bible Chapel was over 1,000, Parker Hill was close to 2,000. And so, like I said, the first time you go out, you're willing to concede on a lot of things. And so we've learned over the course of this not to concede on much. Internally, we talk about it as acquisitions more than mergers. And to the church coming in, you want to say merger, but what we also found is people have the idea that if they're going to merge with you, then we're going to take 50% of what they do and 50% of what we do, and we're going to merge them together. And we don't do that.
Right.
They come into our environment, and if we can find some good in what they're doing, and there's always good, then that's great. But we try to have the understanding that really you're going to become LCBC in this process. And so that's a big step for that church that's coming in to do that. It was a big step for Parker Hill because they're doing so many good things. They were doing so many good things before they merged with us. But they have to be willing to say, okay, we'll kind of acquiesce and do what LCBC wants, even though we think we're doing really well. And they were doing real well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark?
And that's a part of the key to all this. This goes back years that we had begun a relationship with LCBC in terms of sharing ideas, and David and I and a few other pastors would get together in his office a couple of times a year, dating back like 12 years. When LCBC started doing multi-site, we were already a multi-site church, just 2 locations, and they came and they learned from us. So there was a relationship that had already begun, and we learned from some of the same people, shared a lot of ideas. So that made it a more natural fit in our case and made it a little bit smoother. But this all began when I let the congregation know that I was phasing out, regardless of whether it was a merger or some other form of leadership succession. I just felt that I needed to phase out, and I gave essentially 1 year notice. But I also announced the following week that one of the options that we were considering was a merger. And one of the things that helped us, and I don't know if this would work in every church, but we immediately entered into what we called a strategic partnership. And we weren't being secretive. Everybody knew it was potentially leading to a merger, just like dating can lead to engagement and leads to marriage. But what we did is because we're both video-driven multi-site churches where the teaching is delivered by video, we simply, in this strategic partnership, began to use their video teaching on our campuses, which in a merger is sometimes the biggest shift. You're listening to a different teacher, or in this case, set of teachers, because LCBC has a teaching team. And it allowed our people to begin to experience the LCBC teaching style, very much like my style, and get accustomed to different voices. And then along the way, we also, as a part of the process, encouraged our people to visit the nearest LCBC campus. And we would arrange for tours of the building and things like that. So there was a process where people were allowed to warm up to this idea, because it was a shock to our people. Number one, that I was leaving after 33 years. But then number two, that we would consider a merger, because most people have never heard of church mergers. They hear of bank mergers, but in business mergers, but not church mergers. So there was a lot for our people to absorb, and it did take some time. But by using a little bit lengthier, if I can call it, dating process before the commitment, it really allowed us to surface concerns, answer questions, for our people to build a relationship with LCBC Church. And taking that approach for us seemed to work better than a more sudden approach.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so as I'm hearing you talk, it's funny, I'm starting to replay these conversations I've had with my young adult children about dating and engagement and marriage. And, one of the first things I have to help them understand is just because you ask someone on a date doesn't necessarily mean you're committing to long-term commitment to marriage for life. And I think you kind of have to do that here too, in many ways. And David, I know you and your team have been through this several times, but help me understand from your perspective, as you're starting to have this conversation with Parker Hill, kind of how is your team processing it to come to the conclusion, indeed, we want to follow through with this merger?
So to be real honest, the first time I brought it up with the team, and the team being our leadership, we call it strategic leadership team of about 12, and we've got about 280 on our staff, but they were not excited, and it wasn't because of Parker Hill, it was because of a merger. And mergers are great, but they're also, at least in the past, have been very difficult. And again, I think Parker Hill, this has been an incredibly smooth situation for us. Part of our history with both Mark is, as Mark said, he and I had known each other for a long time. Our churches had done things together. The first church that we merged with, most of their people had never, ever heard of LCBC. Even their staff didn't know anything about LCBC. And so it just was a hard transition. Second church that we did, they had a history, same with the senior pastor. They had a history with us. They'd been coming here, so that made it a little bit easier. Parker Hill was probably the closest to us as far as style, but every church, we say all the same things. We may even sing the same songs, but they mean different things. And so the culture is just different. And that's the shock that every church has to go through. And so when I brought it up to our staff, they're like, oh no, are we ready for this? Because it takes a lot of energy away from our staff to help the new people coming in to acclimate and understand who we are. Once we started working with Parker Hill and realizing how closely we were aligned and just the opportunity, then that made a lot of difference, and that helped. And again, for us, we get excited when it helps us get into another part of the state that we wouldn't be in otherwise. And so there's that advantage. We liked their staff as we began to meet with them. And so, Mark, you guys had, 28, I think, or so on staff, and most of them, probably 24, 25 came over and became a part of our team. But we go through a lengthy process of interviewing each of their people and making sure they're going to fit culturally with us and that they're excited about the change. And if we can keep them, we can. And so all of our mergers, acquisitions, we've kept the majority of the staff each time.
Yeah, there was a tremendous amount of conversation that happened before this ever became public. The only people in the know were the upper level leadership of both churches. A tremendous amount of due diligence in terms of financial status, in terms of properties, in terms of staff, who they were, getting to know them, some things like that. So, before this ever became even public the very first time, LCBC had done a lot of homework. We worked through, there's a list of 25 issues in the book, Better Together. We worked through all those common questions, and we're very, very thorough. So I think that's one thing that LCBC may have learned through the process of mergers, is to be very thorough upfront with the due diligence. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't overstate that. I think there's an initial reaction when a church reaches out and is inquiring about a merger that, well, God must be in this if they were prompted to reach out to us. And God may be in it, but that due diligence is so critical to make sure that there's going to be a good fit in the fabric of the two cultures. And ultimately, David, I think you're learning along the way that really one of us does have to be the lead church in this. It's not a 50-50 marriage. There's someone that's leading, and then there's another church that's kind of following in that leadership. And that's critical as well. Mark, I'm assuming at least a majority of your congregation at Parker Hill must have approved this because you are now part of LCBC. From your perspective, what were some of those keys to the success of this merger?
Hey, Mark, before you answer, can I tell them what I kept telling you all the way through this? So
yes, you should tell them. Yeah.
It's the first couple of mergers. The people were not just unhappy, they were angry about the merger once they heard about it in two of the situations. And part of it is they had this sense that they were being sold, and they were upset with, not with us as the church they were going to come into, but they were very mad at the senior pastors. So they were mad at Craig and Scott, were the two guys who were senior pastors. And they would say to Scott, they would say to Craig, you sold us. This is our church. And what gives you the right to sell us to LCBC? And so they were mad. They were furious. And so I kept telling Mark and saying, you guys just need to be ready because it's going to hit at some point. People are going to be mad. And in the first two that we did for the incoming church, when they voted to do this, they were right at, we'd given them a 75% threshold. We said they needed to hit to be able to move forward with this. And they were not much higher than 75%. The first church outside of Philly, as soon as it was announced, about half of the church just disappeared. They just left. And they didn't even know us. So it's not because they were mad at us. They were just mad at the thought of this happening. Second church, it was probably 30 to 40% that ended up leaving before they ever became LCBC. And so that's why we just said, okay, we've got to figure out another way to do this. But I did keep telling Mark over and over, you and your team need to be ready. And Mark, you need to be ready because you're the one they're going to be mad at. They're not mad at us. They're going to be mad at you for selling them out. And there's a lot of history that people have in their churches, and there's a lot of heart and passion, which we all want. But then when it comes to something like this, it gets tough. So with that said, Mark.
Yeah. And you know, our church, like many churches, required our members to approve this. You know, after a period of dating, I couldn't just say I do on behalf of the church. There had to be a member vote because we were in essence dissolving Parker Hill Church and gifting those assets to LCBC Church. So obviously members have to vote on that. So we had to be sure leading up to that decision that there was clarity, and not necessarily agreement, but that there was clarity, and that people had been given every opportunity to have their questions answered, so that at least if they were going to vote no, they were voting no well-informed and with a sense that, okay, I know all the facts here and I can make a well-informed vote. So because we adopted this approach involving a strategic partnership, that gave us some time. And when I announced the strategic partnership, I just said at some point, if we choose to move forward, this will require a member vote. And so when the time came, and it was about 4 months later, after being in this strategic partnership for a while, when the time came, I announced, okay, we feel comfortable moving forward as the leadership. Here's how the process is going to play out. Now, that process included 4 weekend messages on our mission, and as an addendum to the message, and here's why a merger can help us accomplish our mission, and tried to address as much as we could in terms of questions and concerns in those 4 messages. We produced a booklet, much like you would for a capital campaign, that cast the vision for that, and also had a bunch of FAQs at the end that people could ask. David and I did 4 Zoom calls where we just had conversations about the future, and people from both churches could watch those and hear. We had specific topics that we tried to address. We also had town hall meetings where anyone could come, member or non-member, and just hear a presentation about what it could look like in a merger, and then some breakouts with different departments from LCBC, where we had LCBC staff on site explaining, here's how we do kids ministry, here's how we do worship, all of that, and Q&A in those. Then David and I met with key leaders and key givers, either individually or in small groups. And I think we met either individually or in small groups with around 200 people. And David came up to northeastern Pennsylvania, and we got in a car and just drove from meeting to meeting to meeting. It was structured very much like a capital campaign would be, for those who are watching who know what capital campaigns are. And so we just had a lot of conversations, and especially for the key influencers in a smaller group or individual context, it gave them a chance to either vent or ask any questions and feel heard in all of that. And so there were a number of components to this that it was just a lot of redundant conversation and redundant information, to the point where some people were kind of waving the white flag and were saying, yeah, we understand. Can we vote already? But we wanted to get the emotion out of it, because there was a lot of emotion on the front end of it, and let the emotion dissipate and just have a lot of great conversations with people, let them gather all the information they needed, go visit an LCBC campus if they chose to. We continued to use LCBC's teaching. In fact, I got COVID in the middle of that, was hospitalized for 4 days. I couldn't teach for about a month. So the good thing is we were in the strategic partnership already, and we just continued to use LCBC teaching. And so because it was so thorough and there were so many opportunities for people to ask questions and get their answers, I feel like by the time June 7th, 2021, by the time we got to the vote, I felt like we had done everything we could do at that point. And I don't know that every church would do this or should do this, but in the final meeting for the vote, I actually opened it up to questions and comments, open mic, and just felt like I wanted people to have a sense that we weren't trying to force anything or hide anything, and they could still give comments and give input. Largest member meeting ever in the history of the church. We had to actually use two different rooms, the main auditorium, the student auditorium, and set up video feed between them and microphones. And at the end of about an hour and a half meeting, we put it to a vote and had people fill out a paper ballot. And they counted the ballots, brought up the total to me, and I announced it. It was 98.7% positive vote to go ahead and merge, which I was just overwhelmed. My wife and I were just so thankful for that, because you don't want to go into something with 25% of the people, or you can. I mean, legally, we only needed a simple majority. Right. But I felt like that gave us some momentum going into the merger, and it sent a message to maybe non-members who couldn't vote or members who weren't there that, hey, there's kind of a lot of people who are, on board with this. So, and one funny thing about it was I got so caught up in leading the meeting that I actually forgot to vote. And so it actually would have been over 99%, I think, if I had voted. But nowadays, if somebody complains about the merger, I just say, I didn't vote for it, So yeah,
that's fantastic.
There was a long process leading up to it, but I felt like that was the healthiest way to do it, even if it failed to gain the approval of the membership.
Yeah. Well, here's what I'm hearing based on those positive results. And now you're a year into it and you're starting to see the fruit of that as well. But it sounds like you had a great process that both churches went through leading up to the final decisions. Secondly, David, I think it says a lot about your leadership and LCBC's commitment to the mission that God's called you to over the last several decades, that there would be enough trust for Parker Hill to move forward with this. But Mark, the other thing is you just led so well through that journey. And I think it says a lot about your leadership as well. David, in our final moments here, as you might guess, I'm hearing from a lot of pastors, especially at the churches that are coming out of the pandemic on this side of COVID, that are healthy, they're thriving, and yet so many other churches are not. And because of that, I'm hearing from a lot of pastors that are receiving requests similar to this to possibly merge. And so any final words of encouragement that you would offer to pastors as they're considering opportunities like this?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that should be considered and looked at closely. I would also, though, caution and don't just assume that because somebody wants to do it, that you ought to do it. And like I said, our very first one, and everybody's probably going to be like us, where, oh, here's an opportunity. It's our first one. We don't want to mess it up. We don't want to miss out. So we will, in our case, pay $10 million for this property. We will go ahead and do this, even though 40% of the people left. And once you get into it, and even though it was before the vote, once the 40% of the people left, we almost had to do it because their church would have been sunk had we not. And so you kind of get yourself committed to it. So I would just say, just be careful and don't go too quickly and assume it's going to be rosy. I would also say it's hard work. And the first several churches that we did, the staff that we sent to those locations would come back saying, we should never do this again. It's really, really hard work. I would keep reminding them, though, and say, church planting is hard work. And so had we gone to the same area outside of Philadelphia and sent 4 couples and said, you start and plant something, 5 years later, would we have had 1,000 people? Would we have had 50 acres and 100,000 square foot building? No, we wouldn't. But that location, it probably took 3 years, 4 years before I would go to that location and walk away feeling like, oh, that's LCBC now. Whereas if you can align with somebody like Parker Hill that has that same, we go to Parker Hill now 2-3 months later, and it's like, oh, it feels like LCBC already. And so making sure you take the right partners on if you're going to do it. I think too, Tony, one of the things that I think there's got to be a compelling reason for the church that's going to merge with another church. There's got to be a compelling reason to do it. So in the first one we did, it was the finances. It was succession. In Mark's case with Parker Hill, it was succession. It was mission. And what helped with Mark is he told the people when there were tougher discussions, you're going to have some different leader a year from now because I'm stepping away in December. And so if it's not me, it's somebody else. And so one of the beauties of a merger is they could look at us and they know exactly what they're going to get. You could bring another pastor in from the outside. He may look good for those interviews. He may look good for the first 2 or 3 weeks that he preaches. You don't know what you're going to get. And so we just constantly say, you know exactly what you're going to get. You know, the good, the bad. And so that's the advantage of it. From some ways, it's a safer thing. But it takes a great deal of humility on the part of their board. It takes a great deal of humility on Mark's part to say, okay, we're going to give everything we've worked for, everything Mark's worked for the last 33, 34 years, he chose to give to us. And that takes humility and a real sense of mission and calling. Even their board members had to be willing to say, okay, we're going to do this. And it's not an easy decision by any means.
Well, guys, again, it's a great story, but more than anything, I'm just looking forward to seeing how God uses this merger process that you've been in to further the cause of Christ, really throughout the state of Pennsylvania. So thank you for joining us for today's conversation.
Thank you, Tony.
Can I just say again, one of the things that I think is really critical in this is going slower. And so one of the successes also that helped us with Parker Hill, they were a multi-site church. They were used to seeing video teaching. So that wasn't even a shock to them, where the others had not ever done video teaching before. So but taking the time, they got used to us as speakers. So by the time it came around to it, they felt like, oh, they know David, they know Jason. And it wasn't like this whole shock of who are these people that were even being talked to and following. And I know that's a change from past advice that churches have been given. And maybe if it's a dying church and there's only 20 people left, and it's that kind of merger, then I think you go fast. But if you're talking lots and lots of people, then I think you go slower and just make sure people have the time to adjust.